The International Leaders Forum concludes with the panel, The U.S. Role in the World, sponsored by Chevron and the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Please welcome Vice President for the Gulf of Mexico region at Chevron, Warner Williams.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Warner Williams, Vice President of Chevron Exploration and Production Company, North America. It's my pleasure to welcome our distinguished panel and all of you to our discussion today. I'd like to include those of you who are watching our live webcasts or following on Twitter. I want to take the opportunity to recognize the National Democratic Institute and the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Chevron is proud to join with them in sponsoring this morning's program. Today's topic is the future of U.S. global engagement. And as a member of a U.S. corporate community, Chevron certainly recognizes that the American foreign policy tools, such as development and diplomacy, are critical to the nation's and economic security. 95% of the world's consumers live outside of the United States, and it's increasingly clear that America's economic prosperity is linked to the economic currents throughout the world. From major companies and corporations to NGOs, we all have a stake in the future of America's role in the world. So it's very important that countries' leaders continue to hear our unified voice about the significance of greater engagement of the global community. We have a star-studded event this morning, and to get us started, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce Dan Glickman, the chairman of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. In addition to his leadership here, Dan is well known to all of us for his thoughtful voice on policy, especially his service as Secretary of Agriculture and during his 18 years in the House of Representatives. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dan Glickman.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I have the privilege of opening this, and I want to just briefly tell you that the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition is a broad-based group of businesses, NGOs, retired military folks, veterans, and a lot of other folks to promote America's role in the world. We believe that America must be a strong leader in the world and that leadership is strengthened by using all of the tools of national security, including development and diplomacy. And our website, by the way, is www.usglc.org. There are materials out there, and I'd encourage you to pick them up. I have the very special honor today of introducing our first speaker, a very special guest and a longtime friend who can share with us firsthand the experience of this administration's Smart Power agenda, and that's White House Chief of Staff Jack Lew. As White House Chief of Staff and Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Deputy Secretary of State for Management, Jack has been a champion of America's tools of global engagement. And working with our distinguished Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Jack was instrumental in developing and implementing the first quadrennial diplomacy and development review. I was fortunate to have Jack at OMB during my time as Secretary of Agriculture, where he did everything I asked him to do. He may disagree with that, but we'll see. Jack has been a great friend to me and to this community and to the whole efforts of the United States to be engaged throughout the rest of the world. We thank him for being with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage President Obama's Chief of Staff, Jack Lew.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. I've had the pleasure of working with Dan in the public sector and the private sector for more decades than probably either of us care to remember and in more roles. But thank you for your many contributions, both as a public and private citizen. I want to thank everyone here at the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition and the National Democratic Institute for bringing us together today and for the work that you do every day. And to all of our friends and partners who are joining us from around the world, on behalf of President Obama and the American people, welcome to Charlotte and welcome to the United States. You know, it's often said that one of the challenges in sustaining American global leadership is that there's no constituency for American engagement. Well, 10 years ago, that might have been true. Back then, critics of foreign assistance, often had the run of the field with little competition, little pushback. Today, of course, the Global Leadership Coalition is a strong and a vibrant voice for engagement and funding, which is essential in a dangerous world. I'd like to thank you at the GLC and Liz Schreier for the great work that you do. I'd like to thank my good friend, Secretary Albright, and the NDI for the work that you do in building a better world. If, as President Obama has said, the United States remains the indispensable nation in global affairs, then all of you are indispensable partners. And it really is my honor to be here with you today. What I'd like to do is offer a bit of a scene setter for the speakers and the discussion that will follow. And I do so as one who was privileged to sit in a front row seat both with President Obama and Secretary Clinton dramatically reorienting U.S. foreign policy and restoring our standing in the world. I was honored to serve Secretary Clinton as her Deputy Secretary for Resources and Management, where I had the great privilege to co-chair the first ever quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review. And our goal there, as I think everyone here knows, was to strengthen our civilian power. As Director of the Office of Management and Budget, and now as Chief of Staff, I've served President Obama as he has worked to address the legacy issues that he inherited, even as he pursues his own initiatives, including a positive, forward-looking agenda for American engagement in the world. Specifically, I'd like to discuss President Obama's efforts to refocus American foreign policy to include a greater emphasis on what we call smart power, and how this enhances the security and prosperity of not only the United States, but people around the world. And I think it's worth beginning by remembering that the challenge he faced when he came to office was great. 4 years ago, the United States was engaged in 2 wars. Al-Qaeda was dug in deep in their safe havens. Many of our alliances were deeply strained. America's standing in the world was diminished. We were reeling from a financial crisis and the worst recession since the Great Depression. Around the world and here at home, many were questioning whether the United States could continue to play a leadership role. Today, we see a very different reality. President Obama kept his promise to end the war in Iraq. The last American troops left in December, and today, there are no U.S. troops fighting and dying in Iraq. Al-Qaeda's leadership has been decimated. Osama bin Laden is no longer a threat to the world. And Al-Qaeda's plan is on a path to defeat. In Afghanistan, thanks to the courageous service of U.S. and coalition forces, the Taliban has been pushed back. And next year, Afghans will take the lead for security across the country. And in 2014, the transition will be complete. Perhaps nothing illustrates this dramatic shift in our foreign policy more than the number of Americans serving in harm's way. When President Obama took office, there were some 180,000 U.S. troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. 180,000. With the removal of all of our troops from Iraq and the return this month of the surge troops that the President ordered to Afghanistan, we will reduce that number by 2/3. In other words, most of our troops have come home. And as more Afghans take the lead, more of our troops will continue to come home. I mention all of this because ending these wars is the prerequisite for the new era of engagement that President Obama promised when he came to office. For a decade, so much of our foreign policy and our resources were consumed by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. As a result, we were not able to fully seize other opportunities or meet other pressing challenges. As we emerge from a decade of war, we are able to expand our vision and pursue a smarter and more comprehensive engagement with the world. After all, in a changing and challenging international environment, we have to harness the full range of American power, not just our military, but our diplomatic, economic, development power, and the power of our values. As the President states in his national security strategy, we must balance and integrate all elements of American power to include modernizing our diplomatic and development capabilities. You see this, of course, in the President's commitment to diplomacy generally and to the international affairs budget specifically. Even in these difficult fiscal times, the Obama administration has found resources to address our international interests with significant increases in the midst of difficult fiscal trade-offs. And I wish to thank the coalition and so many of you for standing up and being there as forceful advocates for these investments. The international affairs account may be only 1% of the budget, but President Obama believes it's one of the smartest investments we can make. Investments in the dignity, security, and prosperity of our fellow human beings today yield huge dividends for our collective security and prosperity tomorrow. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. I would add, as the changing nature of our foreign policy has occurred, there's been a fundamental challenge and change in our foreign service as well, something Secretary Clinton has championed. In the past, diplomacy tended to take on more traditional forms, working in capitals, serving behind embassy walls, reporting cables, government-to-government meetings, civil society outreach. Now, all these things will obviously continue. But today, our foreign service officers are increasingly expeditionary, posted not just in capitals, but in more remote and dangerous regions, in rural Afghanistan and Iraq, in Sudan and South Sudan. That brings its own new set of challenges, from serving unaccompanied without families to basic security. Indeed, we've seen these patriotic Americans give their lives in the line of duty. And today I want to thank and salute all of our outstanding professionals at the State Department and USAID. Thanks to these Americans, we've harnessed our smart power. We've strengthened key alliances from Europe to Asia, and we're leading again in the Asia-Pacific, a region that will be vital to our long-term security and prosperity. We've engaged more deeply with the United Nations and multilateral institutions. We're working with Russia to reduce our deployed nuclear warheads to their lowest level since the 1950s. We've mobilized dozens of nations to secure nuclear materials and prevent nuclear terrorism. We've rallied the international community to impose the strongest sanctions ever on North Korea and Iran, which President has made clear cannot be allowed to threaten the world with nuclear weapons. We're harnessing our economic power, finalizing trade pacts with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea to increase U.S. exports, expanding trade with emerging powers from Brazil to India to Indonesia, working to open new markets for American businesses, increasing exchanges and collaborations in science and technology, and pursuing a high-standard trade pact in the Pacific that should be a model and will be a model for the world. We're standing up for the dignity of people around the world, such as supporting the people of the Middle East and North Africa as they seek their universal rights. We joined with allies and partners to prevent a massacre in Libya. We're supporting political and economic reform in nations in transition, including Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. Reforms that not only strengthen democratic governance, but improve economic growth, which is absolutely essential for these transitions to succeed. In the face of unspeakable violence by the Assad regime, we're standing with the people of Syria, working to strengthen the opposition, ensure humanitarian assistance, and further isolate and sanction the regime, and hasten the day when the Syrian people will have a government that respects their rights. Beyond the region, we're actively encouraging the reforms that are underway in Burma. And in each of these cases, civil society leaders are helping to lead the reform process, demanding good governance and civic and political freedom for all. The United States is therefore committed to protecting the space for civil society to operate and recognizing the critical role it plays in transitioning democracies, in fact, all over the world. But simply, by working to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and engage other countries in a spirit of mutual interest and mutual respect, with a greater emphasis on a broader range of U.S. power, President Obama has succeeded in laying what he calls a new foundation for American leadership in the world. And perhaps nowhere do you see this more clearly than his commitment to the area that I will focus on for the remainder of my remarks, the development that lifts nations and people from poverty to prosperity. Speaking at the Millennium Development Summit at the UN 2 years ago, the president was unapologetic in his support for development. He said there, "Let's put to rest the old myth that development is mere charity that does not serve our interests, and let's reject the cynicism that says certain countries are condemned to perpetual poverty for the past half-century has witnessed more gains in human development than any in history." As such, the National Security Strategy recognizes development as a moral, strategic, and economic imperative. And on that day at the UN, he announced our new U.S. Global Development Policy, the first of its kind by any American administration. It's it's premised on the conviction that the ultimate goal of foreign assistance and development is to create the conditions where the assistance is no longer needed. It focuses on helping to create the broad-based economic growth that lifts nations and people out of poverty. It prioritizes the empowerment of women and girls as a critical goal in itself and as central to achieving all of our broader development objectives. And it includes a new approach that harnesses the capacity of more nations, more organizations, more sectors, including the private sector. You see, these principles at work across the spectrum of the administration's development initiatives. The President's strategy for sub-Saharan Africa, for example, places a major emphasis on increasing trade and investment across the region as well as with the rest of the world. This includes our support for the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is why the President last month signed into law an extension of the Third Country Fabric provision. And we're partnering with countries to help create an enabling environment and reform their tax systems, which helps attract foreign capital and promote investments. As part of our global health initiative, we're not simply delivering medicine, we're working with countries to help strengthen their health systems and deliver better care. As a result, we've increased access to health care, helped bring down the cost of vaccines, and over the next few years, we'll be helping to save the lives of 4 million more children. Related to this, the President has built on the important work of President Bush in combating HIV/AIDS. Under President Obama, we've increased support for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And on World AIDS Day last year, he announced ambitious new goals, providing antiretroviral drugs to more than 1.5 million HIV-positive pregnant women over the next 2 years, and helping 6 million people get treatment by the end of 2013. As a result of these and other efforts, we can now imagine what was once unthinkable, the possibility of an AIDS-free generation. As part of our food security initiative, Feed the Future, we're helping countries develop their agricultural sector and improve crop yields. This builds on the commitment that the U.S. and our G8 partners made at L'Aquila 3 years ago. This past spring, the President announced a new alliance for food security and nutrition that brings more nations, international organizations, and companies together around the shared goal. Starting with $3 billion in private sector commitments in the 3 countries where the alliance is beginning, we aim to boost farmers' incomes and over the next decade help 50 million men, women, and children lift themselves out of poverty. Finally, I'd like to point to the Open Government Partnership, where dozens of nations have come together to promote transparency and accountability that's necessary to uphold both human rights and economic development. After all, the biggest hurdle in many countries to economic development is corruption. Through this partnership, nearly 60 governments are collaborating with civil society, making use of new technologies to fulfill their commitments to good governance, transparency, accountability, and strong institutions, the foundations for development and broad economic growth. In closing, I simply note that all of these initiatives are pieces of our larger ongoing commitment to the assistance that saves lives and the development that uplifts countries and people. Under President Obama, we've increased assistance to the least developed countries. We'll continue to be the leader during humanitarian crises, and we've done as a single largest donor of aid in the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. To President Obama, this is a moral obligation. As the wealthiest nation on earth, we have a moral obligation to help others. We're making sure, he said, that the United States will be a global leader in international development in the 21st century. That's the essence of smart power in the 21st century. This is how President Obama and our administration have reoriented American foreign policy, turning the page on a decade of war and expanding our vision to pursue a broader array of opportunities and challenges. This is the foundation of a new era of American leadership that the President has laid, a foundation that recognizes the unique leadership role that the United States plays in the world, a foundation that requires all elements of American power, and a foundation upon which we intend to build in partnership with all of you. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Ladies and gentlemen, President Kennedy once remarked at a large White House event many years ago that he had never seen so much talent in one room since Thomas Jefferson dined alone. Well, he never saw the talent that we have here on this stage. And I'm going to briefly introduce everyone. I think all their bios are in the material that you have, but I just thought I'd mention a few things about each one of them. Obviously, Madeleine Albright, a very remarkable woman who needs no introduction. She's been the board chairman of the National Democratic Institute, the 64th Secretary of State for President Clinton, the first woman to hold that position, and one of the truly great world leaders today and for a long time to come. Senator Dianne Feinstein, senior senator from the state of California, first female president of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, first female mayor of San Francisco, a senior senator on many committees and known for her work in foreign policy, intelligence, in a variety of different areas, and when history is written, she will be remembered as one of the truly great members of the United States Senate. Michèle Flournoy is the co-chair of the National Security Advisory Committee of Obama for America. Prior to that, she served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and the principal advisor to both Secretaries Gates and Panetta. Tim Roemer was a colleague of mine in the U.S. House of Representatives. He most recently served as the U.S. ambassador to India. He was a congressman from Indiana and a distinguished member and public servant in areas of international trade and national security. Jim Steinberg is the dean of Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, and he also had a long career in government, having served as Deputy Secretary of State under President Obama and Director of Policy Planning in the Clinton administration. And lastly, our moderator for today, and most of you will recognize him as well, is Richard Wolffe, an award-winning journalist. He's been at the Financial Times for many years, a journalist and political analyst for MSNBC, the author of various books, including Renegade, The Making of a President. So in this capacity, I think President Kennedy would have to revise his comment of many years ago, and please welcome this very distinguished panel.
Well, Dan, thank you for that generous introduction. I am the moderator. First of all, thank you to the NDI and for all of you for showing up today. As moderator, in addition to having to live up to those introductions, I also have to keep the trains running on time. So here's the plan. For the next 40 minutes or so, this august panel will be solving the world's problems. I will try to trip them up every now and again with some questions about global hotspots and this election thing that's going on right now. And then we're going to open it up to questions from the floor. I believe there are 2 microphones either side, so start preparing your questions. I'm told you're not a shy group, so I expect lots of good questions. But if you are shy or you're technologically proficient, we can take your questions via Twitter. Use the hashtag, I'm going to read this out so I don't get this wrong. Use the hashtag ILFNDI, and I promise you, we will get down to those questions. So without any further ado, let me try and set up a tour of the horizon with, if I may, Secretary Albright. Every 4 years, I hear people say, this is the most consequential election ever, and by the way, this is the most challenging foreign policy environment ever. Now, I thought the post-Cold War era was pretty challenging for you. I thought the post-9/11 era was pretty challenging for your successors, but we also have both those eras and the post-Arab Spring era. So my question to you would be, do we have the international architecture to deal with all of those problems? American leadership is still indispensable, but how is that supposed to function in such a complex world with the institutions we have?
Well, first of all, thank you to everybody for being here, and thank you for moderating us. It is the most complicated and most consequential, and all those things that you said, ever. I really do believe that. And I think partially since we're in a political setting, I would say every county's been heard from. I mean, every conceivable part of the world has spoken up. Every kind of problem is out there. Jack Lew, I think, described very well the additional kinds of issues that are now considered national security issues. And we have added to that the whole era of information technology, Twitter, is not alone. All of a sudden, we all know everything about everything that's happening everywhere, which I think raises a lot of issues out there to be dealt with. So what are the structures? And part of the problem, I believe, and I have been known as many things, but I am a political scientist, and so looking at it in terms of structure, we have been living with institutions that were created in the 20th century that don't work particularly well in the 21st for any number of different reasons. And so I think we are looking at institutional crisis in some terms and some just kind of incapability of dealing with the problems. And I don't think that there is a lot of faith in many institutions. I think it happens in each country in terms of its state institutions or federal institutions. The greatest faith is actually there with the most local institutions, those that are the closest to the people. And I think there's a real strain in terms of how international institutions are working. Part of it is that the system was set up to deal with nation states.
Right.
And nation states are not the only players now. We talk about non-state actors, and non-state actors are, we just heard from Campaign One, non-governmental organizations, or terrorists, or multinational businesses. They're different. I don't mean to equate any of them with each other, but they play by different rules, and the system is not set up for that. So I do think, in addition to specific problems in different areas, plus issues that cross lines, for instance, dealing with terrorists or nuclear proliferation or poverty or energy, environment, et cetera, those are issues that require a lot of people and countries to participate in, and then individual bilateral relationships, and then the non-state actors means that the institutions, I think, are deeply strained, and we need to work on those.
Okay. Michèle, I had a very nice question about military-to-military cooperation for you, but I'm going to start off with something about the Arab Spring, because it strikes me you're an advisor to the Obama campaign as well. So Syria throws up all sorts of challenges, practical challenges, but also some of what we want to talk about in this panel in terms of the limits of where American leadership can take us and the limits of what institutional or collaborative arrangements with other countries can achieve. Does Syria show the limits of the system we're in, the world we're in right now, or is it very much, would you see it as a Syria-specific set of problems?
No, I think it's a combination of both. The challenge in Syria is enormous. The civil war is deepening. The humanitarian catastrophe is getting worse. It's very clear that Assad must go and that he will go. He has lost any legitimacy. This government will fall. The question is, how long does that take and at what cost? I think the administration has rightly been focused on what will force a change in the situation, and that is trying to build cohesion within the opposition. At the strategic level, working with them to develop a transition plan and a platform that clearly protects minority rights, that invites the Alawites and others to join in the future of a new Syria. And at the operational level, providing command and control and communications equipment and so forth, trying to give them more coherence. But this is going to, I think everybody wants this to end as quickly as possible, but the real key is getting that political cohesion inside the opposition. I think you've seen us, because there's no institution that can really deal with this effectively, you've seen the U.S. investment in really catalyzing international consensus in the region and more broadly on an ad hoc basis to try to deal with this very difficult problem.
So my follow-up would actually be my worthy question here, which is, I'm going to criticize my own question. The media, we all focus on the tough, dramatic questions about the toppling of leaders and use of military force, but isn't the hard work post-revolution? And on that level, in terms of democracy development, for instance, the work that the Pentagon has been doing in democratic control of military institutions in these countries, how do we fare on that? I mean, do we have the tools to actually deal with those things if we believe in smart power and in that post-revolutionary situation?
I do think that this administration has really tried to operationalize the notion of smart power, not only in post-conflict situations, but also in pre-conflict situations, trying to prevent conflict in the first place. And obviously, diplomacy and development are the biggest elements of that. But there are cases where mil-to-mil relationships, education, working with counterpart militaries has enabled us to help educate others on what is the proper role of a military in a civilian-run democracy. That's a new concept for a lot of our interlocutors. And when you have an American military that prides itself on being responsive to civilian control, being apolitical, being a support of part of the foundation of our democracy, it's a very powerful way to engage these countries and help them adapt their own institutions to be fully supportive of democracy as they go forward.
I want to move my bias from the right side of the panel to the left. Jim, I've heard for many years about the diplomatic surge that needs to happen in these post-war situations. Do we have anything approaching that now? And can you really use civilian tools, for instance, in Afghanistan, where our military personnel are under personal threat, a very real threat to their lives from Afghan security themselves? So is a diplomatic surge still a rhetorical phrase, or does it have reality on the ground?
I think it's a work in progress, but I think it's been one of the highlights of what President Obama and Secretary Clinton have tried to do, is to really rethink the way we do diplomacy and development, to train a new generation of people, to bring in a new approach. One of the real hallmarks of the last couple of years was drawing on the experience of the Pentagon with the Quadrennial Defense Review, as Secretary Clinton established the QDDR, Democracy and Development Review, because she recognized that what we didn't have was the capacity to meet these needs of a diplomatic surge, of a development surge, of a stabilization surge, that we had to think about our structures, our processes, and also our people. What kinds of people do we need, what kind of resources, what kind of training, to do the kind of long-range planning that the Pentagon has always been so good at, and to marry that up together so that we don't have two separate stovepipes of the military on the one side and the State Department and AID on the other. And the partnership that has been developed between the Pentagon and the State Department and AID, I think, is unprecedented in recognizing that all these tools have to work together, that they each has a role to play, but they work better if they're integrated from the beginning, in the planning as well as the execution. So we're seeing a change in the way the State Department does business. The institutional change is bringing together more of the operational parts, bringing together development with democracy, with human rights, with other aspects of how we deploy forward, of seeing how we can prepare our planning better to do these contingency planning so we're ready to go as these crises develop, if they're unanticipated, and can anticipate them, as Michèle said, for prevention. Now, obviously, we need resources to do that. It's a challenging time, budgets are tight, but I think what we've seen is a recognition that you can't just do a one-legged stool here. It has to be all three parts together.
Senator, if I'm being the superficial journalist that I play on TV, I'd say that the shift we've seen from the Bush era to now would be broadly characterized by this debate about unilateralism and multilateralism. When you boil it down to a country like Pakistan, with all of its challenges, the way we want to approach it in a collaborative fashion on development, military to military, but then you've got times when you need to take unilateral action, specifically counterterrorism action. How do those things match up when there are real intelligence demands, pressures, counterterrorism pressures? How do Democrats, how does the United States square that circle?
I think all of these are wrapped up in the same situation. And I think right now with Pakistan, there is a reality, and that reality is that Pakistan is a nuclear power with several dozen warheads. And the ability to have a positive relationship with that country is important. Ergo, building trust and credibility, which candidly had been rent asunder, is important. There are some changes. Specifically, there's a new head of intelligence. He's been to this country. Some of us had an opportunity to meet with him. He could well be a breath of fresh air. I don't know. Events will show that. But he is willing, I believe, to begin a new era of cooperation between our intelligence service and the Pakistani intelligence service. I've become very concerned, and if I could just quickly say something about Syria, because I think our government has made very clear in the real and practical world that Assad must go. However, the thing that puzzles me is after 10 years in Iraq, after our lost people, after nearly $1 trillion of expenditure, the Iraqi government will not freeze the airspace and prevent Iran from sending equipment into Assad. And we have asked, and we have asked, and they have not. This, to me, is a very important signal of where Iraq could go. And I would hate to see the development, really, of another Iranian proxy in the area. And I think this needs a good deal of attention right now, because, as Michèle said, Syria is a serious, serious situation. And we have begun to work multilaterally and cooperatively. And therefore, countries like Turkey and Jordan are taking a much greater role, and even the Saudis, in trying to be helpful and put a regional imprimatur in that area. Assad must go, and it has to happen relatively soon. I think the loss of life is becoming intolerable, and the way in which this loss of life is taking place is intolerable. So that appears to me to be a major question. Many of us at this have talked about what happens with the Arab Spring and the fact that we've got 9 nations who have been buffeted from the inside, and there's no way of telling what kind of stability is going to emerge. That's a huge issue. Egypt is a huge issue. Egypt is kind of the 800-pound gorilla of the area. Whatever you may want to say about Mubarak, he recognized Israel's right to exist. He recognized that a two-state solution was the only way. And he was helpful in many respects. Which way this new president will go, no one knows. So I am strongly of the opinion that this next year is a very important year to get these things sorted out, and that we have to watch very carefully, and that we shouldn't compel countries. We can try to be flexible with them, but candidly, I'm not so sure we should put $1 billion into Egypt unless Egypt is willing to move in a direction away from radical Islam.
Well, let's open this up to everyone in the panel, because you raised an important question about Iraq. What tools could the United States use in the next 4 years to try and influence Iraq in terms of its relationship to Iran, and specifically with the situation in Syria? Are there tools that are not being used now? Is there leverage that the United States could use, obviously in the realm of smart power, since we've exhausted hard power avenues, right? Tim?
Well, Richard, I'd like to kind of combine your question and go back to the question you asked Secretary Albright about what the structure looks like. I think the president has done a great deal of thinking in his foreign policy formulation over the last 3 or 4 years about how the world has changed over the last 20 years. From the demise of the Soviet Union, when we had a bipolar system between the United States and Soviet Union in the Cold War, to more of a unipolar system. And now it's an indispensable leader, the United States, forming partnerships with invaluable allies around the world on different sets of issues using, I think an Indian scholar came up with the term balancing power, balancing smart and military power, soft and hard power. And let me give you a couple examples to come to the second part of your question. The United States has worked with a coalition of military powers to remove Gaddafi from power and try to work on democratic regimes coming in afterwards. They've worked very closely and carefully with the Indian government and people on Afghanistan, on development issues, economic, educational issues, where India has devoted over $2 billion to smart development in Afghanistan for a regional settlement there. The United States is working with partners in the Indian Ocean. This is part of the rebalance toward Asia. When you have the Straits of Hormuz through the Straits of Malacca to the South China Seas, we see an area where About 90% of trade now is on the ocean, and about two-thirds of it is petroleum, or two-thirds of the petroleum trade goes on the ocean. So the United States is a country that needs to make sure those sea lanes are protected. And we work with a different coalition of partners on anti-piracy efforts in that part of the Indian Ocean. So you have development partnerships, you have military partnerships, you have smart power partnerships around the world that I think the President and Secretary Clinton have done a masterful job in trying to balance the use of these powers and the challenges that are coming at America and the world over the last several years. Where that balance goes in the next 4 years, the next 10 years, I think you'll see more of that kind of formulation.
Okay. Anyone else want to pitch in?
I just add, picking up on Tim's point, that I think one of the insights has been that these emergence of these new powers is not at the expense of the United States. It's not a zero-sum game. We need all the capacity that the world can bring to deal with these big challenges, whether it's piracy or terrorism or dealing with energy problems. And the more we can bring them together to the table and to recognize that working together and seeing the capacity of countries like India and Brazil and China and others to be able to be partners with us means we have a better chance of solving these problems. Doesn't mean we're always going to agree. We've seen over Syria, for example, that we had an important disagreement, and we can't shy away from making clear where we have those differences. But being able to recognize the need that the big problems of our time need more rather than less capacity means building these new kinds of flexible arrangements, finding partners when we have shared interest is really critical to success.
Okay, so let me try and trip up the panel here. This is election time, and obviously we're in an election where, surprisingly, foreign policy has not played a huge role, but still there are differences that people on both sides have tried to raise. Are the different, we've got an international audience here, so explain, take a crack at this one if you will. Are the differences we're hearing on foreign policy between these two campaigns, are they matters of rhetoric? Are there real differences in policy approach here? Obviously, as a nominee, Mitt Romney didn't really talk about war at all, about Afghanistan at all, in his acceptance speech last week. So, in some context, trying to step back from where we are today, are there significant differences between these two sides here moving forward for the next 4 years, or is it just part of the campaign football season?
My own view is that any candidate has to be very careful in what they say. I think to make the statement on my first day, I'm going to declare China a currency manipulator, is not the wisest thing to do. And I think I've spent a long time getting to know Chinese things and China and watching China's development. And I see the real need. Of course, I'm a Westerner, and it's the century of the Pacific and all of the trade and so on and so forth. China is expanding. China has a more aggressive young military. China is moving into the South China Seas, which I had always been assured prior to this time would be done in a legal way in terms of legal solutions. Hopefully that can still be put forward. I think one of the things that Secretary Clinton has done and that Madeleine tried to do and did was really establish a big relationship with China, and Jim did as well. And I think that's extraordinarily important. There is no reason for us to be anything other than allies. And I think we really need to look to develop that very much. And, you know, saying you're going to declare somebody a currency manipulator on your first day in office doesn't make much sense to me.
I actually do think that there are differences, and part of it has to do with rhetoric, but I have to say, I did say that when I was Secretary of State, I had all my partisan instincts surgically removed. They've all grown back.
It's good to know that's
yes,
medically possible.
But basically, I do think that the Romney people are living in a different century. And just the flat-out statement to say that Russia is our biggest geopolitical problem is a 20th century concept. We are living in the 21st century. That makes it a very different story. And I do think that there is a kind of one or two-dimensional view that the Romney people seem to have in terms of what national security is about. They haven't made a lot of statements, frankly, except kind of belligerent ones, if I might say. I do think that one has to take into cognizance what the mood of the American people is. Clearly, we are focused domestically. Jim and I have been involved in many campaigns together, and one of the things that I used to say, we were both foreign policy advisors. In order to make ourselves more important, we would say that domestic and foreign policy were interrelated. They are. We succeeded, right? You know, but the bottom line is never has it been truer than now. And I don't think that is being pointed out in any kind of a intelligent way to explain it. And then the issues that have already been raised here in terms of what foreign policy and national security are about these days. So that has not been out there. And I do think that there are major differences. And the point that Dianne makes, I mean, what's he going to do on day number 2? After he's declared China, that, you know, so.
He'll be dealing with repealing Obamacare, right? Tim, did you want to?
Yeah, I want to jump in, and I think Madeleine actually is being kind, saying Governor Romney is coming from the 20th century.
Kind.
Might be the 19th from what he has talked about in terms of his vision. Let's talk about a couple of the differences. And this is where I see elections as a very good thing here and in the world. Because some people look at elections and they say, well, it freezes action. You can't talk about foreign policy. It's all about domestic policy and the economy and jobs. As President Clinton said last night, it is about jobs, and it is about what the president inherited. And let's look at what he inherited on foreign policy and what he's done. The president has honorably and respectfully brought all our troops out of Iraq. Governor Romney would have left them there. The president has said we're on a timetable to bring our troops home out of Afghanistan and honor our commitment there, and then try to help solve through smart power the reasons why we went. Governor Romney each day says something different about whether or not he supports a timetable coming out of Afghanistan. We don't know how long the troops would be there. Governor Romney took a foreign policy trip and went to our closest ally to talk about a subject matter that he should be pretty comfortable with, the International Olympics. Yet he fumbled that, and David Cameron had to come back and rebuke him. So if you can't handle the easy issues with our closest ally in Great Britain on the Olympic Games, how are you going to handle war? How are you going to handle peace? How are you going to handle bringing our troops home? I think there are very big differences between what the president has achieved and accomplished, how he's used smart power. When he came to see us in India, when I served as ambassador, he kept telling me over and over again, make sure you're working on American jobs in India. Make sure that you are using the export power of the United States to make things in America, and that India will buy those products, creating jobs back home. And that trip resulted, I think, in 24,000 American jobs being sustained and created at home because of the president's hard work to sell things overseas.
So I got my political fix. That's great. The organizers will be really upset with me, but so I apologize for that. But let's try and look forward here. Say your desired outcome comes to pass. President Obama gets another 4 years. Michèle, you worked on the first presidential directive on development, on global development. Whoever's president, there are going to be budget constraints, budget pressures, very real budget pressures. And while it's a small part of the budget, maybe the smallest parts are the ones that come under the first pressure because it's not entitlements and it's not military. So how does a commitment to development survive the kinds of budget pressures any next president is going to face?
So I think, you know, as we think about the coming budget pressures, I would look to the recent experience we've had when the Budget Control Act was passed and the Pentagon had to find $487 billion of cuts over the next 10 years, as required by a bipartisan majority in Congress. What did the president do? He didn't just, you know, sharpen the knives and start cutting salami slicing. He said, wait a minute, we have to step back and we have to do a strategy-driven review. We have to rethink our priorities in light of our resource constraints. What are we going to do? That led to a review process that very clearly articulated the defense priorities, got all of the chiefs, all of the combatant commanders, the entire uniformed military on board, signing off, supporting a new way forward. I expect that we will have to do the same thing on a much broader level, looking across diplomacy and development and the military going forward. And I think this president understands the importance of doing that from a strategy-based perspective. I also think he understands, as Jack Lew said, not only the moral imperative, but the strategic and economic imperatives of development and our support for development. And it's such a small portion of what we spend with such disproportionately strategic effects that I think there'll be strong support in this administration to protecting that, or second-term administration. The challenge will be in Congress. Here, I'm heartened by the fact that there are some new constituencies coming on board to strongly support development, but that is going to be the challenge. We have to better educate the American people about the strategic value of development going forward.
Okay. Jim, 4 years' time, we can talk about development some more, but I'm interested in the phrase, the pivot to Asia. What does 4 years of pivoting to Asia look like at the end of a second Obama term?
I think this is, an enormously important period. You talk about why is this a consequential election, because I think that the stage is being set that's going to shape the politics and the economics of Asia for generations to come. China is clearly emerging onto a stage. It's having not only to deal with its relationship with the United States, but with all its neighbors. And how we, both the United States and our partners, engage with China over the coming years, I think is going to set a context in which makes it either possible for China to take its place as an important contributing member of an Asia-Pacific region which is stable, prosperous, drives global growth, helps deal with the big challenges like climate change and energy security, or creates a new era of instability. And I think that the willingness to see how big the stakes are, to recognize that our presence is indispensable for shaping the environment that allows China to take its rightful place, but in a constructive way, that reassures our allies that they can live in a world where China is important and powerful, but they aren't going to be left alone, they aren't going to have to feel insecure, they're not going to have to do things that might increase stability, that we can build trade, that we make sure that China lives up to its international obligations to be fair and free in its trade, but also to welcome it as an engine for growth, and to build the kinds of relationships like through the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the President has been pushing to create a new set of links between countries, links on energy, links on trade, links on environment, that creates a very stable region. This could be the region of peace and stability that drives the world, but it will take the foresight to see what we need to do it, to sustain our engagement, to recognize that that engagement is not just military, but it's political and economic, to be there with our traditional partners, but to realize that we don't have to trade that off with developing relationships with new countries, to bring India in as an increasingly important actor in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think that's a tremendously exciting opportunity, but also a period of risk, because if we don't take advantage of it, we could see a very dangerous future.
Senator, we haven't yet touched on Iran. Next 4 years, well, I remember actually the second Bush term was supposed to be the time when Iran had to be dealt with, and the timeline keeps moving further and further back. First of all, do we reach the tipping point with Iran in the next 4 years, in your view? And secondly, is there more room for a collaborative, smart power approach to Iran, or are we actually reaching the end of that road as well?
My answer would be yes and yes. I think we do reach a critical point within the next 4 years. As Iran is proceeding today, I think most people would agree that Iran will be a military nuclear power within 4 years unless there is a change. And I think very strongly, I was delighted to see when the P5, the European Commission, instituted this series of negotiations with the P5+1. However, it may well be that there isn't sufficient flexibility within that negotiating mechanism to work something out. And this is of deep concern to me. I think, and I've said this to the administration, I think that there has to be a way of ascertaining whether the Supreme Leader is really interested in doing an agreement, and that America may have to step up in a bilateral negotiation where all things are on the table. What could happen if Iran becomes a military nuclear power, I think is potentially catastrophic, and that we really have to take the steps to prevent it. And it would be my hope that China and Russia would even be more active. They're members of the P5+1. But as I look at this, it's a much more rigid negotiation process than just sitting down bilaterally. I just think that everything has to be done to push diplomacy to see if there's anything that we can do to prevent Iran from becoming a military nuclear power.
Before we go to some questions, Tim, Secretary Clinton has talked about economic statecraft. You've been in a country where that would seem to loom large, in India. How do you see that kind of economic statecraft playing out in a country that, to be frank, is a competitor economically on the job side of things for America, but is also obviously a developing country, a trading partner? What's your experience of trying to perform economic statecraft with a country that is clearly a rising economic power?
That's a great question, and I think how the president has visualized this and practiced this policy with India is twofold, Richard. One, and it goes back to your question to Jim, I didn't like the phrase in the question about a pivot to Asia. It's really a balance of our foreign policy to recognize the number of people in China and India, the growth potential for our export market. We're not going to turn our back on Europe, on NATO. We're not going to turn our back on the Middle East and our commitment to Latin America, Mexico, and Canada. This is just a refocus and a rebalance, not a pivot away from something. There's competition with China. There is potential conflict with China. There is cooperation with China. The United States wants to see a successful and peaceful rise there. With respect to India, in your question, I think the president has seen great potential to almost work on a concert of democracies in Asia with India. That India strengthening its neighbors like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and the talks going on right now with Pakistan that are showing progress on economic issues and trade issues, India's investment in Afghanistan. This very well could see a blossoming of more democracy in Asia as we work more closely, not only with India, but other partners in Asia. I remember when I went to meet with the president at the White House before I went to serve as ambassador in India, and we went through the strategy and we talked about how he saw the relationship in the next 5 or 10 years. And then he said, in terms of your question about statecraft, he said, Tim, and he walked me to the door and he put his arm around me and he said, I want you to shake hands with all 1.2 billion people in India. Don't just get to know the Prime Minister and the members of Parliament, get to know the farmers. Go into the poorest areas in Mumbai and Delhi and Kolkata. I want you to show the moral imperative of American values to all the religions and the people there and see where we can put together these partnerships with NGOs, businesses, USAID, and work together with this country.
And how many hands did you shake?
I had a young man come up to me on a train on the way up to Amritsar one day, a 12-year-old young man, and he said, are you the American ambassador? And I said, yes. He said, I want to be one of the 1 billion people to shake your hand.
Oh, is that nice? Can I add to that? Because I think it brings it back to the first question that you asked me, which is that economic statecraft requires many more players within it. And we, in the last panel, there was discussion about public-private partnerships, and Tim has just mentioned them. And so I think we have to figure out a system where we're comfortable with having major corporations sit at the table at the time that negotiations and a variety of issues are taking place. They have to play a very important role in this, not just in job creation, but also in value systems and looking at how various issues come up so that the system has to adjust now to a whole new set of stakeholders. And in order to deal with the issues that are all out there, whether they are health or energy or environment or jobs, it does require a larger table, and I think that's what the structures have to look at.
Good. So we have some questions from Twitter, which we'll throw open to the whole panel. So let me start doing that. This is from P. Lopez 92. What do you think is the best way to engage American youth in these global issues and stake a claim in the world's future? Anyone want to take that one?
I'd be happy to. As the resident with youth today, I'm very encouraged by the tremendous change that's taken place among young people in America. This is the first globalized generation. They think about the world differently. They understand. Madeleine talked about how people know about everything that's going on every time. But borders are not meaningful to them. They understand their connections and their relationship. And so I think the challenge for all of us is to give them outlets in a sense that they can take that instinct that they have and put it to use in a meaningful way. And again, drawing on Madeleine's thing, it's obviously I'd love to see some of them engaged in government service. That kind of public service is still indispensable to get the best and brightest. We have to get away from a sense of people feeling that there's no future if you go in, that it's a dead end, that it's not a respected profession. We have to reestablish public service as a valued and honored profession. But we also have to train them to be able to work in NGOs and in multinational corporations, to give them the sense that they can make a difference in their lives, whichever avenue that they make, but that they have to do it by understanding how others think, being able to sit and put themselves in other people's shoes, to give them the experience of languages and cultures, so that when they get into that globalized environment, they can be effective, they can be proud of their own traditions, but they can also be active participants on this world stage. They're so energized by what they're seeing in the Arab Spring, what they're seeing around the world. They want to be part of that, and I think it's our challenge to give them the opportunities and the outlets to be part of it.
We'll do one more from Twitter and then open it up to the floor. I think we have microphones on either side. This one, forgive me if I'm not saying the Twitter handle correctly, but this is from Soy Puri. While the US dealt with Iraq and AFPAC, South America became more assertive, pulling the rug beneath the OAS. How does the US deal with this? Who wants to deal with South America?
Well, I do think that our relationship with South America has always been complicated, if I may say so. We're damned if we do or damned if we don't. If we don't pay enough attention, then they say you're not paying enough attention. If you do, you're interfering in our domestic affairs. Right. So it is not a simple issue, and but I do think that our future, what happened, the most revolutionary thing I did as Secretary of State was to move Canada into the Western Hemisphere. It actually was in Europe, and according to the State Department. But since it's in the Western Hemisphere, technically, the bottom line was in order to increase the numbers of democracies in this. And I do think that there is a huge partnership here that we can and should have with Latin America in any number of different ways, both in terms of values, in terms of how they can be part of the partnership aspect. Brazil is clearly a major player, but so are other countries. Mexico is not, we have more complicated and interesting relationships with Mexico than any other country in the world. And I do think that there are many, many opportunities here to do more things together, but it does require a sense of respect from both sides and an understanding of the importance of democracy and development. One of the things that I have been pushing is, in fact, the importance of development and democracy, because democracy has to deliver, and people want to vote and eat. And so the bottom line here is how to make that happen in our own hemisphere.
Okay. Excellent. So,
may I just say one thing about young people? I think it's really very important to spend some time on history of an area of the world that you're interested in and really become proficient in it. Sort of develop a portfolio of expertise in one area. And then, you know, there are all kinds of opportunities with NGOs, with Senate offices, House offices to come in, intern, for young people even to staff for a period of time. And I think it really gives you a leg up. But I also think understanding a country is very important. I don't think you can, you know, it's in an age of specialization to some extent. People have to know what they're talking about. It's very important.
I agree. Richard, if somebody comes to the microphone, can I just fill in on Diane's answer about young people, because this is such an important question? I have 4 children, and they love technology. And they think sometimes technology can replace going overseas and living in a culture and learning that culture and speaking that language and seeing what the people think and believe and work on every day. My children did not initially want to go to India when the president asked me to serve. By the end of the term, they were volunteering at Mother Teresa's. They were traveling all over India and into Bhutan and Sri Lanka. They now have a thirst to learn about the world. And we have to get our students, as Jim said, out of our universities and overseas. And the second part would be, we need to be able to bring students to America and not shut our doors to foreign students coming to study here. I happen to know there are 103,985 Indian students in American schools. That is a good thing. We should welcome that. They contribute to our economy. They help us start jobs and new entrepreneurial efforts in the Silicon Valley and here in North Carolina in the Research Triangle. And then when they go home, if they go home, they have the sense of what American values are all about, and they like us. That's an important thing to keep doing.
Well, as an immigrant and a new citizen, I agree wholeheartedly. Let's do some questions in the spirit of Twitter. Can we try and keep them brief, if not to 140 characters, at least concise? So excuse me about being rude and shutting you down, but let's try and rattle through some. Let's start over the left here.
Good afternoon. My name is Annemie Nates. I'm a Belgian member of the European Parliament. It was sobering to realize that, except just now in passing, the European Union has not been mentioned once. Does that mean that we have become irrelevant, or do you take us for granted?
Those sensitive Europeans. Who wants to deal with Europe?
Why don't
go ahead, Michèle.
I'll you first, and then I'll be happy to chime in.
Don't make me do it.
My answer is always, I'm a European just like you. I just happen to have been raised in the United States, so I can say all kinds of things about you. I believe that Europe needs to get its act together so that we can, in fact, be partners, because I think the United States counts very much on a partnership with Europe. It is in our DNA in all kinds of different ways, and Europe is not irrelevant at all. And I think part of the issue, and why Jim talked about rebalancing rather than pivot, there is nothing that is saying that we're leaving Europe behind. I think we're counting on Europe to be a partner with us as we deal, an equal partner, as we deal with various of the other issues out there.
Let's go to the right.
My name is Matar Ibrahim Matar. I'm a former MP in the Bahraini parliament who was detained just to be part of the uprising and supporting the pro-democracy movement there. First, I'd like to thank the NDI for their commitment for Bahrain case. Even after they were forced to leave the country, they keep committed, and they open for us the link to reach the congressmen from Democrats. So thanks for them. My question is about the foreign policy of U.S. government and the Gulf region. Is there any difference between the Republicans and Democrats on this issue? I want to raise a point which was mentioned by Tom Malinowski. He is the head of Human Rights Watch. He was saying that U.S. government is putting their credibility under a real big, difficult questions when they ignore all the violations of a human right in the Gulf just because they are strong ally for United States. Okay. U.S. government is use the Fifth Fleet, use Bahrain to have the Fifth Fleet there, and they are supporting the most dictator regime.
Okay,
Our Prime Minister spent 40 years in his position, and he is not elected.
All right, let me just take the question. So we've got lots of people wanting to ask questions. Michèle, is there a difference between the two parties on this?
I think there is. President Obama has been very clear that he sees the only path back to stability in the Middle East is through reform, political and economic reform. I think that this administration has invested substantially, both diplomatically and economically, in supporting reform movements. I think in those areas where reform has not yet reached, we are also pressing regimes privately to embrace reform. There is no way to turn back the clock. There is no way for authoritarian regimes in the region to be completely immune from the overwhelming trends of democracy that are spreading. And I think President Obama has been squarely on the side of reform and on transformation of governments to be more responsive and accountable to their populations.
Richard, can I just add a word on this? Because first, I want to pay tribute to the speaker, who many probably won't know, but I personally know the positive role that he's played, and the role that the forces within Bahrain who want to use a peaceful and political solution to move the country forward has done. And I frankly regret, and I think the President and the Secretary regret, that the leadership in Bahrain has not taken advantages of voices like his. We've had a very intense dialogue with the Bahraini government. I myself, personally, have been there, have discussed this with the King, with the Prime Minister, with the Crown Prince, with members of civil society. This is enormously important. You're right, U.S. credibility is at stake here. We obviously believe that in the first best case, we try to work with people who have been our friends over time to try to persuade them that it's not just in our interest, but in their interest as well to make these changes. And in the long term, it's in everyone's interest to see this process move forward. There has to be dialogue. There has to be engagement. This is not going to work simply to shut out moderate voices. It's only going to radicalize voices on other sides. So I think many of us admire your courage and admire the work that you're trying to do. I know Tom well. That's his job, is to push us all in these things. But I think you can be fairly confident knowing that that's a perspective that the President and the Secretary share. The President was criticized for some of the outspoken things he said about the leadership in Bahrain, about the harsh crackdown, about the unnecessary use of force. So I think we're always going to be pushed by human rights groups. That's good. But I think the issues you raised are legitimate and serious ones, and I think the President and the Secretary are very much focused on them.
And I apologize for cutting you short, but I'm mindful that we do have a limited time and lots of questions. So let's take another one over this side.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Shukriya Bargzai. I'm a member of the Afghan Parliament. I passed 3 continents and left my 5 kids at home to come here and just to know what will be the situation of Afghanistan after 2014 with such ignorance. I believe this blue-green attack which is starting, is just beginning. It will assure your national security in the United States. Would you believe this transition can exist and work on a proper agenda as we hope for it? And would you believe that ignorance of Afghanistan may not remind the silent majority which has been victim for the Cold War and right now to again be a victim of this war against terror for the second time or not? Because I believe my nation, my country also deserve democracy, and that democracy needs to exist and implement. We shouldn't victimizing the Afghan people because of 1,000 corrupt governments or because of the 50,000 insurgents they are leaving. Would you not believe that the current state and policies from the United States will give Afghanistan back to be a safe haven for tourist activity?
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a great question and a great questioner again. Senator?
If I might try to respond to that in some way. Recently, I had the opportunity to meet with a number of women from the Afghani parliament in Kabul. And I found them just amazing women, really dedicated. One of the big concerns is, ladies and gentlemen, that the Taliban comes back. And the Taliban controls or contests about 37% of the land in which people live. That's a complicated, but that's a correct number. And they form a kind of shadow situation. While we were there, after we met with the women, the Taliban attacked 14 out of 17 schools and closed them, and then killed 5 education officials, I guess just to show their power. So the point I want to make about the women was their absolute commitment to democracy and their absolute understanding of what it meant should the Taliban come back. My own view is that it's still very dicey. with respect to that. The other thing that we heard a lot about was corruption, which is probably the Achilles heel, perhaps unwittingly, I don't know, of the Karzai government. So there are a lot of very difficult problems there. But let me just say this, and I feel particularly strongly about the women, that we cannot go back to the way things were. We have a real investment in your security and your survival, and I think the openness of your society. And I want to help in any way I can because I really care about this.
Thank you.
If I could, since I had the privilege of visiting your country many times and worked very much on the president's strategy, you know, all of our newspaper coverage tends to be about the security side of the situation, you know, the progress that's been being made in an area or lack thereof, the drawdown plans, the transition plans. But I think one of the things that's gotten lost is the fact that the US government and the Afghan government have signed a strategic partnership agreement. And what that really does is outline a longer-term relationship focused on economic development, focused on political reform, focused on safeguarding minority rights, focused on combating corruption and so forth. And so I think that the issues you raise, you're right to raise them. Those are going to determine whether ultimately Afghanistan is able to seize this chance at democracy and a better form of governance and a better form of life. But it's that long-term commitment in these other dimensions that I think will be most important. And this president's been very clear that he understands that and that he's playing the long game in terms of support for those kinds of reforms.
Thank you. I think we have time for just a couple more. So one over here, please.
Thank you. I'm Kitty Wang with NTD TV. I have a question about U.S.-China relation. We know that U.S.-China relation is the most important foreign relation United States is trying to manage. But also we have seen there are many unstable factors within China itself, such as the political scandal this year before the power transition upcoming next month, and also the very complicated relationship between the military and the civilian leadership, and also the declining economic situation. So my question is, do you think United States should be prepared for any potential political crisis within that might come up, or how do you evaluate the situation? Thank you.
I defer to Senator Feinstein.
Yeah. Well, I don't really see a big political crisis coming up in China. China, though, still has a certain opaqueness about it. It is very hard to understand. There's no transparency. People don't have press conferences, don't reveal new initiatives. I knew a former president quite well because we were mayors together, Jiang Zemin, and he was a very open individual and spoke his mind, and everybody knew kind of where China was coming from. I think the government is more opaque right now. There is going to be a transition. We'll see how the new government performs. But I believe there is a strong willingness and interest by the United States to work closely with China. And I think Secretary Clinton, who has been there, has tried to do exactly that. It's often difficult because there are many conflicts. There are human rights issues, there are other issues that come up and that sometimes can sidetrack the relationship. But basically, I believe very strongly what the United States wants is a constructive, positive relationship with China, and one where we can work together on some of the world's big problems. That would be the best of all worlds.
Let's try and squeeze in one more just over here, please.
Thank you. My name is Paul Dewar, Member of Parliament from Canada. I'm the Vice Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Official Opposition Foreign Affairs Spokesperson. And Secretary of State Albright, thank you for relocating my country. Feels good to be back home. And I also should say a lot, the Secretary of State, Clinton, she's done a lot to refurbish and renovate the reputation of your country. I want to say that the biggest challenges we face, I think, are catastrophic climate change and nuclear proliferation. On nuclear proliferation, there's been a lot of work done, and to thank the administration, particularly the Prague speech we all remember. So that my question is the following. Going forward, what is the best strategy to get to zero? Is it, for many of us, we're looking at nuclear weapons-free zones like the Arctic and the Middle East, or is it just to get straight to work on the convention that people have talked about, or is it a sequence of both? I'm concerned, I'm deeply concerned, we're losing the momentum, and frankly, it's now up to middle powers to push it, and it's up to citizens to push it. It's leaders who have taken leadership. I think it's now our turn, but what's the best way there?
Michèle?
It's a great question, and I think the president remains very much committed to the goals laid out in his Prague speech. The truth is it's all of the above. We're going to have to press on many fronts. Nuclear weapons-free zones, preventing the next round of proliferation, preventing Iran from going nuclear and having a cascading effect in the Gulf, for example. But also continuing with arms control among the declared nuclear weapons states, seeing if there can be additional rounds to bring current arsenals down in number. But you remember when in his policies, he's laid out a number of conditions that really need to be met before we can get to zero. Conditions that build trust, conditions that build transparency, conditions that build confidence in our ability to verify. We need to be working at setting those conditions as well to really be able to go to very low numbers.
Can I just add one thing on that, Richard, which I think it's also important. I agree with everything Michèle said, but the other thing the president has done is he's provided leadership. So he initiated a nuclear posture review in which he took some steps to reduce our own reliance on nuclear weapons, to think about different ways of achieving our objectives without placing them, a recognition that the more we can get away from that as part of our strategy, the better it is. And so I do think there is a special responsibility of leadership that the president has really shown, supported by the Secretary of Defense, by the Joint Chiefs. This has been really stepping up to the plate, recognizing that we need to do this with others, but the United States has a special responsibility to lead.
And I think to go back to the question about what are the differences between an Obama second administration and a Romney potential one, this is the biggest one. Just the policies that they've already said, New START is not a good idea, any number of different things. I think this is a major difference and one that we have to keep in mind. I think it is a key one.
Could I follow up on that just
Briefly,
quickly?
we have the red light flashing, which Clint Eastwood can ignore, but we probably can't.
There's no empty chair up there.
No empty chairs.
You know, the START Treaty, START 2, was very difficult to get ratified in the Senate. We have the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty coming up, which I hope it's possible to ratify. We have somebody that I have great respect for, General Cartwright, who is one of the greatest strategists from a security point of view, who believes we can do with 950 nuclear warheads and really bring the arsenal down. And if you can do that in conjunction with Russia, it is a major contribution because there is no reason for these big, huge warheads that we have out there in the thousands between Russia and the United States. And I think that's an area, you know, the deterrence that once existed when the Soviet Union was there was one thing. It's a totally different world today.
Can I just have 20 seconds?
You can.
I would just say, agreeing wholeheartedly 100% with what Madeleine said, there is a very distinct and big difference between what the president has articulated, in particular with the New START Treaty with Russia, but also what the president has devoted so much of his time on in keeping nuclear weapons and proliferated material out of the hands of terrorist groups. He does this daily all around the world. And this is the kind of issue that Jim and I were talking about earlier, the kind of issue that is a non-traditional issue where you can forge these new partnerships through smart power. And we haven't even begun today to talk about agricultural partnerships for food security, water security partnerships. The population of the world is going to be 8 billion people in the next 10 years. And water usage is going through the roof. How do we find ways to prevent war based upon the scarcity of water? These are really compelling issues that I think many of these foreign dignitaries and ambassadors and diplomats and members of parliament can help work with us on to solve in the future.
Well, I'm sorry we didn't have time for more of your great questions, but please join me in thanking NDI and this exceptional panel today for a great conversation. Thank you.